the way down over his ears, some hair is
Following
going
day,
to show.
December 8th, he was sentenced.
In the year 1976, 46 years ago, Virgil Presnell was sentenced to death for the murder. Hello and welcome again to the Death Row and Executions channel. I'm Paco Rivera. A last-minute death warrant that just came out last month has set a date of execution for 76-year-old Murray Hooper in Arizona. He is scheduled to be executed this month on November 16th. He's been on death row about 40 years and finds out a month before that he will be executed. Hooper was convicted and sentenced to death along with two other accomplices in the 1980 murders of 46-year-old William Patrick Redmond, who mainly goes by just Patrick or Pat, and his mother-in-law, Helen Phelps, as they were preparing for a New Year's Eve party in Phoenix, Arizona. Patrick's wife, Marilyn Redmond, was also at the home. She survived the brutal attack that included being shot in the head and went on to identify the perpetrators in the home that night. At first glance, this would appear to be your basic home invasion robbery that tragically ended with those in the home being killed, but that may not be the case. It was believed that a lot more people were involved in this, and that this was actually a murder for hire situation, with the home invasion robbery set as a camouflage of sorts for the murders. This is one of the most complicated cases that I've worked on so far. First of all, about the first 20 or so reports that I read on it gave me about 20 different stories. So I tried to find all the common ground from the reports as a way to better present the facts to you. Now, I'll be tossing a lot of names out here today, but I will try to make it as simple as possible for you to be able to keep up with it. One of the victims in this case, Patrick Redmond, owned a very successful printing business in Phoenix along with a partner named Ronald Lukasik. Prosecutors at the time had stated that a Tempe, Arizona businessman named Robert Charles Cruz, who had family connections with Ronald Lukazic's wife, Joyce Lukezic, met up with Patrick Redmond and Ronald Lukezic to discuss getting into their printing business or buying it from them. Now, Robert Cruz, also called Bobby Cruz, was also a known mobster from Chicago with ties to organized crime, and he was looking for a way to launder money from his illegal activities. And like I said, Cruz was also a close family friend of Joyce Lukezic. Ronald Lukezic was open to the idea of partnering with Bobby Cruz. His wife, Joyce Lukezic, is said to have been thrilled at the idea of possibly making millions of dollars from the business with her Mafia man friend running the show. But Patrick Redmond, who seemed to stand on more moral grounds, chose not to involve himself with Bobby Cruz or the likes of Mafia-type characters. He refused to sell the business that had already made him fairly wealthy, and he refused to allow Bobby Cruz into the business. Investigators later alleged that Bobby Cruz had hired a former police officer from Phoenix named Edward McCall to kill Patrick Redmond. They in turn hired two men being referred to in reports as hitmen from Chicago. One was William Billy Bracy and the other Murray Hooper. Others believed to be involved in hiring the hit was the wife of Ronald Lukezic, Joyce Lukezic, who later co-authored a book about her case called False Arrest. More on that a bit later. A prosecutor theorized that the two black men were hired for the killings to help keep authorities from thinking that the Mafia organization had anything to do with it. Let's briefly go over what happened on the night of December 31st, 1980. Patrick Redmond, along with his wife Marilyn, were at home with Marilyn's 70-year-old mother, Helen Phelps, in Phoenix. Marilyn and her mom were preparing meals for a New Year's Eve celebration. Other friends and family were expected to arrive later in the evening to ring in the new year of 1981. Patrick Redmond was sitting on the couch watching TV. There was a knocking at the door, and someone went to answer it. Possibly Marilyn or her husband Patrick, depending on the report that one reads. A man later identified as Edward McCall, the former Phoenix cop, showed a police badge and told the family inside that he had some questions. Moments later, he took out his gun and forced his way inside, along with two other men behind him, also with guns, Billy Bracy and Murray Hooper. The three intruders escorted Patrick, Marilyn, and Helen into the master bedroom. The men then gathered up jewelry, money, and several weapons from the house. At some point, the three family members were placed face down, side by side, on the bed. Their hands and feet were wrapped with tape. Socks were placed in their mouths to gag them. Patrick and his mother-in-law, Helen, were shot multiple times in the head. Marilyn was shot once in the back of the head. Lastly, one of them used a knife to slash Patrick Redmond's neck. Miraculously, the bullet shot into Marilyn's head was angled in a way that it somehow missed her brain completely and the bullet came out from her mouth. The intruders then left, believing that everybody in the house was dead. The former cop, Ed McCall, was the getaway driver. Now here's where this story really starts to get crazy. A jailhouse snitch in Phoenix named Arnold Merrill, or sometimes called Arnie Merrill, looking to get a lighter sentence, contacted authorities in Chicago and told them that he knows of two men involved in murders in Chicago that happened around Thanksgiving time when the two men killed three drug dealers. He said their names are Murray Hooper and Billy Bracy. He then offers a bombshell, telling authorities in Chicago that he dropped off both men at the airport in Phoenix for a flight to Chicago. Arnie Merrill said that both Hooper and Bracy were arguing in the car and yelling at each other when one told the other, "That woman is still alive. Why the F did you shoot her just once?" Merrill told the detective in Chicago that Hooper and Bracy were involved in killing a family in Phoenix and that he should look into it. And that's exactly what the detective did. The Chicago detective contacted authorities in Phoenix and told them that he has two men in custody possibly involved in the killing of a family over there. The informant, Arnie Merrill, had also said that the two men were in possession of $50,000 that they had received from a Chicago mobster named Bobby Cruz, now living in Phoenix, and that it was he who ordered the killings because he wanted to take over some guy's printing business, is what Arnie Merrill had told this detective. Meanwhile, back in Phoenix, a woman named Bindi called police to tell them that the two men from Chicago that they had been looking for were staying with her while in Phoenix and that they were selling drugs. She'd said that the night that family in Phoenix was murdered, a man came to her home to pick up the two men, and she happens to know the man. His name is Edward McCall, and Ed McCall was once a Phoenix police officer. Bobby Cruz, with Mafia connections in Las Vegas, New York, and Chicago, was seen as a man wanting to achieve higher ranks within the Mafia. a John Gotti wannabe, so to speak. To become a made man is how the Mafia refers to them. While operating his businesses in Phoenix, some surely illegal, it is said from those in his inner circles that he came up with the idea of laundering money by taking over the very lucrative printing business owned by Patrick Redmond and his partner, Ronald Lukezic. Investigators then learned that Ronald Lukazic's wife, Joyce Lukezic, had family ties to the mobster, Bobby Cruz, and that they have been in contact. After Marilyn Redmond recovered from her injuries, she positively identified Edward McCall as the man who knocked on her door that New Year's Eve night and displayed a police badge before forcing his way inside with two other men. Marilyn was then flown to Chicago, where she also identified Billy Bracy and Murray Hooper as the other two men. So the prosecutors trying these cases formulated their theories with as much proof they had that a chain of events ensued whereby Joyce Lukezic asked her family friend, Mafia mobster Bobby Cruz, to have Patrick Redmond killed. Bobby Cruz then hired the former police officer, Ed McCall, Billy Bracy, and Murray Hooper for the hit. In 1982, Bobby Cruz went to trial in Maricopa County Superior Court along with Ed McCall in a joint trial for both men. Both men were convicted and sentenced to death. On October 6, 1983, the Arizona Supreme Court reversed Bobby Cruz's conviction and called for a new trial, ruling that because Cruz and McCall were tried together, the jury had been prejudiced by Cruz's Mafia connections. Following two more trials in 1988 that ended in mistrials because of hung juries, Bobby Cruz, at his fourth trial, was found guilty of first-degree murder again and sentenced to death a second time. That fourth trial was then overturned when a higher court ruled that it was unfair for prosecutors to eliminate three persons from the jury pool because they were Hispanic. Remember, Bobby Cruz has a Hispanic last name. In 1995, in a fifth and final trial, Bobby Cruz was found not guilty. Jurors later interviewed stated that Arnie Merle, the informant, gave every impression of being a habitual liar, and everything he'd said was discarded by them. It is reported that Cruz then began spilling out all kinds of details about the Phoenix family murders since he can't be tried for it again. All that talking was something the Mafia was probably not too happy about. In November of 1997, Cruz vanished from the face of the earth. Probably resting, some might have joked, right beside Jimmy Hoffa. However, 10 years later, in the year 2007, contractors clearing marshland for a new housing development in DuPage County, Illinois, about an hour's drive from Chicago, found the body of Bobby Cruz buried. His hands were tied, he had been shot in the back of the head execution style, and he was wrapped up in a tarp. It all had the markings of a Mafia hit. Some reports indicate that Bobby Cruz simply talked too much. That will always get you in trouble with the Mafia. The informant, Arnie Merle, had also said before the murders in 1980 that he overheard a conversation between Bobby Cruz and Joyce Lukezic in which Mrs. Lukezic had asked Cruz why it was taking so long to get rid of Patrick Redmond, and that Cruz had told her, "Don't worry, it will happen in December." Remember, the jury didn't really care for Arnie Merle's testimony. Joyce Lukezic later wrote a book on her story called False Arrest. According to one review, she was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. However, other reports show that she was convicted, but before they got to the penalty phase, the trial was overturned on appeal, and she was found not guilty in her second trial. During that time period, she had spent 2 or 3 years in prison, depending on which report you read. In a blurb for the book, it reads, "The tranquility of Joyce Lukezic's affluent Phoenix neighborhood was shattered by the violent deaths of 2 residents. Joyce, a young housewife, was arrested. Thus began a 2-year nightmare for Joyce, who would see her calm world destroyed and buried beneath lies and deceit by her friends, her husband, and even the police and prosecutors who were supposed to protect her rights." A TV movie was also made from her book in 1991, starring Donna Mills, Robert Wagner, and Stephen Bauer. After spending years on death row, the former Phoenix police officer, Edward McCall, died at the age of 68, while still incarcerated on death row. On February 18th of the year 2000, that's when he died. His cause of death is not reported, but his final location was listed as St. Mary's Hospital in Tucson, Arizona. Both Billy Bracy and Murray Hooper were tried and convicted in Illinois for the murders in Chicago and sentenced to death there. They were also tried and convicted and sentenced to death in Arizona for the murders in Phoenix, and that state is where they ultimately ended up on death row. William Billy Bracy had also died while on death row in Arizona before the state had a chance to execute him. Ronald Lukazik, who was Patrick Redmond's business partner and the husband of Joyce Lukezic, was never implicated in the crime. No proof was ever obtained that he had any involvement other than going along with his wife and wanting the mobster, Bobby Cruz, to be a part of the business that he owned with Patrick. The final man convicted in this case, in which the conviction held, is Murray Hooper. He would turn 77 years old on the 22nd of November. He is scheduled to be executed on November 16th, 6 days before his birthday. There will be 2 executions that day. Stephen Barbie in Texas, a video I did on him was uploaded a few days ago, and that of Hooper in Arizona. After the death warrant for Hooper was issued this past month, a lawyer representing him, Kelly Culshaw, issued the following statement. For 40 years, Mr. Hooper has maintained that he was wrongfully convicted and sentenced to death based on corrupt police practices and unreliable witness testimony. No physical evidence links him to the crime, and Mr. Hooper's execution should not be carried out until an analysis of key fingerprint and DNA evidence, which was scientifically unavailable at the time of his trial, has been completed. And what about Marilyn Redmond, who saw him in the house that night and positively identified him? If you would like to see more of these death row stories, please subscribe so that you're alerted when the next one comes out. I'm Paco Rivera. Bye for now.